So Ligon, a while ago, you posted something on the Reformation 21 blog about Nevin is not the answer. Why did you do that? What does that cryptic message mean?
Right. I think my title was less challenging than that. It was something like Bavinck versus Nevin.
Oh, you're right.
Everybody would have immediately recognized was anachronistic, et cetera.
Yes,
and I expected them to do so. My point was, the point that Bavinck is making in that statement is that in the face of dead orthodoxy, all of us are concerned about piety and about conversion and about a lived out a theology. We're not interested in having our heads filled up with notions that do not express themselves in the totality of our being, in the way we think, in the way we act, in the way we live. And so I think Bavinck, probably in his context, speaking against the dead orthodoxy of the continental Reformed churches, is saying don't be too quick to cast aspersions on the movements amongst the Pietists and the Methodists that are actually in their own way trying to foster a revived religion. Now, however anti-churchly it may be and denigrating of the ordinary means of grace as it may be, there's a kernel of something here that we need to pay attention to. And of course, that debate has been going on for a long time in our little neck of the woods.
Yeah.
But I just thought I would stir up the hornet's nest and see what happened.
Different than stirring
It's the
up.
first time you've done that.
Yeah, I know. I've never done that before, Mike. So.
Different than stirring up the Horton's nest. There are also some of those. Yeah, so would you say, Mike, are you a pietist?
No.
But you do believe in piety?
Sure.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, I think pietism was an understandable reaction against a perceived, and I say because historians, can go back and forth on this, a perceived dead orthodoxy in the state churches. You look at the paradoxes, not paradoxes, contradictions of the Reformation and the post-Reformation state of churches that were still under the government of the state. They were state churches, and if whatever territory you were living in, if it was a Lutheran territory, you were a Lutheran. If it was a Reformed territory, you were Reformed. If it was a Roman Catholic territory, you were Roman Catholic. And in that kind of a situation, you just have, as my friends in the Church of England tell me, their people in their parish bring their kids to them. They've never seen these people before, and they say, "I want my baby done." That's what happens in a state church environment. And pietism arose as an effort to rekindle, in a lot of ways, early pietism, the genuine spirituality of the Reformation. But it degenerated too. And what we see again and again is that orthodoxy can sort of lose the energy of the original discovery of what it was orthodox about, and it then just becomes about holding on to whatever doctrines were recovered, not discovering those yourself and being as gripped by them as the Reformers were, and that generation was. And then pietism itself degenerated into a kind of introspective moralism that was alien to the Reformation.
Well, when do you think it degenerated? You're a much better theologian in history of theology. I was reading just a little bit of Spener, who would be sort of one of the fathers of pietism in the Lutheran context. And he's saying that some things that were revolutionary in his day seemed very commonplace to many evangelicals about we need to be studying the Bible on our own, we need to be having these prayer groups, we need more than just polemics from the pulpit. But he also has a paragraph where he says the Lutheran catechism ought to be taught, we ought to hear it. And so I read that and I think, well, he sounds pretty good. He still wants the Lutheran catechism there. So is it later pietists that degenerate, or do you see the seeds of it even in those first generations, someone like Spener?
I do. With Spener and Franca even, you have this idea of a church within a church. And instead of reforming the visible church that you're a part of, even to the point of saying, we're not going to allow state churches, we're going to reform the structures of the church, you simply live within the visible official structure. You're on the registry. You may even show up to the public worship. You may be baptized, and you may receive communion a couple of times a year. But really, it's what happens in the small groups of the truly committed, where true awakening and revival happen. I think it's that spirit of not the visible outward structures and the ordinary means of grace, but the special thing that happens when just a bunch of Christians or just a few Christians get together and focus not so much on official things like preaching and public prayers and liturgy and baptism and the Lord's Supper, but focus more on sharing their personal testimonies and so forth. It's a tendency to polarize. There's always a tendency to polarize in church history.
Right. And so, I mean, as I think of it, I always think of myself as a confessional Christian. I'm in a denomination that has confessions. I love the confessions. I've written a book on the confession.
Great book.
Thanks. And piety is obviously important and interwoven into our confessions. And so I see the dangers of pietism when it becomes deeds, not creeds, kind of atheological, when there's such an emphasis on surprising conversions that there's no allowance for what Doug Wilson called boring conversions, the organic growth of the church. Sort of, you need to tell me the precise moment that you were converted, and what you said, that small group Bible studies are where the action really happens. Church is, Sunday morning. That's not really. So I agree with all of that, and yet I want to make sure that confessional folks like us are not afraid of affections. Maybe this is where some of us would diverge. I think on the whole, the Great Awakening was a good thing that has had good influence on the church, certainly some abuses and some trajectory issues, but that there's affection, not anti-revival, not anti-conversion, praying for conversions, for this deep affecting piety, small groups. So can you have confessionalism infused with pietism, or what does that look like? Can it even work?
Well, and I would argue that the Scottish tradition has, from its very outset, had a very strong confessional self-identity from before there was a Westminster Confession back to the Scots Confession of 1560, and at the same time a strong emphasis on an experiential piety, not an anti-church piety, not an extra ecclesial piety, but a piety that's expressed within the framework of a confessional church. Now, there are a lot of parallels between Scottish piety post-Puritan era and what's going on in England with the Puritans. And you may want to comment on that. I've never talked about that with you because you've looked a lot at the discontinuities and continuities of continental piety and confessionalism and British Puritan confessionalism. But I've always found in the best of the Scottish tradition a happy wedding of those two things. Now there are you can walk through eras of Scottish Christianity, and especially in its Presbyterian phase, and you can look at high points and low points. The 18th century, for instance, by and large, from about 1710 on, was not a happy era in Scotland, to the point that you can find this statement being made by William Cunningham in his book Historical Theology, that weakness, slumber, and death characterized the churches of Scotland at the turn of the 19th century. The churches where once the voices of the Covenanters had echoed, and then before that the voices of the Knoxes and the Melvilles and the Hendersons, were now basically sold out to some sort of an Enlightenment moralism. Moralism just reigned in Scotland. And in combating that, there were people, evangelicals in the 19th century in Scotland, who not only pointed to piety and found points of continuity with things that were happening in America with the Great Awakening and such, but could point back to earlier sources of their own piety and say, let's go back to those old ways. And you can even find ministers of the Church of Scotland in the 1600s making the same kind of statements. I think it's what do you do in the face of nominalism? You know, if you're dealing with nominalism, what is the answer? I think American pietism and much of American evangelicalism since that has basically given an anti-churchly answer to that.
Right.
But I can find resources in the Scottish Presbyterian tradition that didn't have to go anti-church and anti-confession to do that. Now, that may be an anomaly in the development of
the Second Reformation, the Dutch Reformation, had some of those same points.
Right. I was going to refer to that too. I don't think that there is this grand contrast between continental developments and English Puritanism. Your description of Scottish Presbyterianism. I think that the Reformed tradition in that respect is different from the Lutheran development. With Lutheranism, I think orthodoxy and the pietist movements really diverged.
Split. Oh, okay.
And a lot more than in the Reformed tradition. You know, some of the best Reformed scholastics, writers on any topic of theology you can imagine, were also the writers of the prayer books and the psalters and the writing these amazing prayers, devotional guides. You just didn't have a divide between those who were interested in piety and those who were interested in the doctrine.
Right.
And so I think it was more integrated then. I fear that in our tradition now we're so polarized that thinking through we've always had that tension, but I think we're probably more polarized today on that.